Hello, and welcome to our AdamSmithWorks paper preview series, where we highlight papers related to the life, times, and ideas of Adam Smith. I'm Christy Horpedal, the assistant editor at AdamSmithWorks, and today I'm talking with Michelle Schwarze about her recently published journal article, Adam Smith on Education as a Means to Political Judgment. It's published by Political Research Quarterly. I will include a link in our notes so you can read it for yourself. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, how are you, Christy?
I'm good. Thanks so much for joining us for this. Your paper is attempting to correct the record on Adam Smith's views on education. So it's not about creating good little pin makers and rich merchants so we can all luxuriate in opulence after the division of labor and the invisible hand do their work, right? So what is your argument that it's more than that?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. We're trying to, I guess, push back on a little bit of the literature on the function of education for Smith. So a lot of interpreters who read his works notice that he has a defense of something like public education in book 5 of Wealth of Nations, but they usually chalk up why Smith thinks we need to defray the cost of education, the public needs to defray the cost of education for the working poor, to things like issues related to market progress, especially moral problems created by the market, that people are unable to sympathize with another, that they don't really feel like human beings anymore. This is the language that Smith uses to describe workers who are in the pin factory doing, 1/17 of a part of the creation of a pin, or economic problems. Or finally, they're somewhat cynical, I think, about his defense of public education, and see him as suggesting that the role is really to keep the working poor in particular, complacent, and to keep them from rabble rousing when the government tries to do things that are good or bad for them, right? And so what we try to do in the paper is unpack Smith's defense for education, as well as the content of what the education he proposes is, and explain, we think, that Smith actually has an interest in enabling individuals to make political judgments. So it's not just a corrective to the economic or moral ills of the market. It's definitely not this cynical view of keeping people complacent, but rather that it allows people to exercise this capacity, gives them the skills to exercise this capacity to make reasonably well-informed decisions about political matters, tempered by a healthy skepticism of those in power. And that's a really important point for Smith. I think he's, in the paper, we talk a lot about the ways he's interested in enabling people to see through the designs of people in positions of power and authority.
So preempting effective propaganda, right? To undermine its ability to sort of be as persuasive. I really liked that point in your paper. So this is the tough question in the paper preview. You call out some big names in the paper, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan. I'll get a little dig there at the end, although you think it's deserved. But how do you think that those, if they were around to be critical, or other people who might be critical in the same way, what do you think some of the critical responses to your paper might be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the possible criticisms of the paper, sort of the main criticisms of the paper, fall into two sets. The first is really those who would disagree and don't see there as being sufficient evidence or reason to think that education is designed by Smith. His plans are designed to enable people to make these political judgments. But really that there is this cynical reading, and they would point to passages in the text from book 5 where Smith says things like, for example, that the educated masses are less apt to be misled by any wanton or unnecessary opposition to the measures of government if they become educated. Or I think they would point to the content, as I'll suggest in a minute, of the education he proposes, and thinks it's a little too bare bones to actually enable people to be politically sort of aware and capable of making these judgments. And then finally, I think maybe there would be a set of critics that would say, Smith is not interested in anything like defending democratic government, or this idea that individuals are supposed to be educated by the government so they can make choices about who's in power, right? Or do things like vote on referenda or whatever. On the last point, we're never suggesting that. To be clear, he thinks, and he clarifies in the section that he writes on public education, that these are skills he thinks are important for people who live in free government. But Smith himself is not a, capital D Democrat, or really even a little d Democrat. So he's not recommending those suggestions. He just thinks that it is important to people who live in free governments. And moreover, he thinks that the risks associated with compromised political judgment, especially this tendency to fall for propaganda and the designs of political leaders, that is a risk that exists in many different forms of government, not just democracies. As for the other 2 points, why he thinks why we think his education is something more than those cynical reads, or something more than just a corrective, and why we think the content is very different, or more than simply, getting people to read and write an account, and why that doesn't amount to much. What we talk about in the paper is a comparison of what the kind of education that Smith recommends, what that would look like in comparison to what was offered to the working poor at the time. And really the key takeaway here is that it is much more secular. And that's important for Smith because it means getting away from the power of the church, getting away from 2 things he was most concerned about, and that connect to this concept of political judgment, which are the role of factions, both political and religious, in affecting how people make judgments. So he actually calls for a distinct kind of education separate from the church, and making it independent in that way really is pretty radical and controversial at the time.
I also think I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, that he not only wants to have people protected against propaganda from the government, but also from the savvy merchants who might sort of come together. So he's pointing to different places where this misinformation could come from, and trying to guard people against both of those. Did I remember that correctly?
Yes, that's right. And so that we might consider that more economic judgment, still falls within the breadth of judgment as a whole, right? That education is supposed to enable judgment, but enabling people to be able to make good economic decisions and to not be swayed by economic propaganda by different people who have power in the market is really important too. And there's actually great work by Alex Oprea at UNC Chapel Hill on political judgment, actually an economic judgment, that came out this past year in the Journal of Politics that focuses more on that.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get her on a paper preview as well. So thank you for suggesting her. What are you working on right now?
So 2 things. I think I am working on one piece on Smith with a co-author that investigates what we call romantic liberty, which is really this freedom from toil and anxiety that Smith discusses in the theory of moral sentiments, which is pretty overlooked. We usually think of the system of perfect liberty and wealth of nations, the freedom of the market, or a lot of intellectual historians focus on the modern liberty, the liberty of the subject, right? Constitutional protections or civil liberty. And yet in TMS, in a famous passage on a chapter on ambition and the origin of the distinction of ranks, Smith associates the pursuit of ambition with the loss of this kind of liberty, with the loss of the freedom from toil and anxiety. And so what we try to do in this paper is explain what that phenomenon is really, what that kind of freedom is, why we think it's valuable for Smith, and then what that trade-off looks like in commercial society, whether there's anything to account for, sort of make up for the loss of that kind of freedom that comes with the gain of the market freedoms and also the liberty of the subject.
Great.
Yeah.
And you said
And the
there-
second thing, yes, the second thing is unrelated to Smith, so I won't talk too much about it, but I'm starting a book project on Judith Sklar and her skeptical liberalism, which is really interested in looking at the moral psychology behind her account of liberalism, because it's one that's particularly attractive to us today, given its realism.
Great. Well, I look forward to both of those pieces when they come out. Last question. I know you mentioned Alex already in her paper. Is there anyone else that you think that we should interview, a suggestion for a paper or a person that we could look at next?
Yeah, I think your viewers would be really interested in hearing more about a paper from Yifta Elazar, who's an academic at Hebrew University, and actually my co-author on the Romantic Liberty Project, to be totally upfront. He wrote a piece in the Journal of the History of Economic Thought this past year called Adam Smith and the Wealth-Worshipping Spectator. And that really focuses on commercial ambition and explains, according to Yifta, how that's a misguided desire for excellence, how effectively what happens when you have wealth worship in a society is individuals' desire for recognition related to sympathy gets warped when they use an inappropriate spectator. Instead of the impartial spectator, they use a spectator who's been corrupted in some way. So fantastic paper, and I think your audience would really enjoy hearing more about it.
Great. Well, I will reach out on that one as well. Thank you so much for being with us today. Michelle Schwarze is an associate professor of political science. Her research focuses on the intersection of moral psychology and political theory, especially in the 18th century and in Adam Smith's works. Also, she is currently serving on the executive board of the International Adam Smith Society as the secretary treasurer. Thank you so much for joining AdamSmithWorks for this paper preview.
Thanks for having me, Christy.